We're about to go on a journey exploring the natural world and learning from the wildlife that live out here all the time. Through studying their tracks and the signs that leave behind, we're going to actually get glimpses into what happens when we're not actually able to watch them, and we're going to learn from that, learn about ourselves, learn about the intricacies of ecology, and learn about the future as well. Learn about history. There's so many pieces that start to come together as we start to study the natural world in this kind of way. One of my favorite mysteries to come across in nature is stumbling across a skull that's been left behind. And we can learn an incredible amount by looking at these skulls, and we can actually learn a lot without even knowing who it is right away about that animal's strategy, its life strategy through the patterns in the skull. So what do we learn when we look at this one here? Just observing right off the bat, look at how flat it is. Like, it's very narrow this way compared to how long it is right now. So that's one piece of information that's relevant here. I can flip it over and look at the teeth. They're very sharp, jagged teeth, which tells me that it's probably something that has a carnivore diet. And something that's really interesting when I look at the flat skull here is I can actually see the little hole there where its ear canal comes out. So imagine it's going to have its ear right there. Its eye is actually on the same plane if I was to draw a line that way, and its nose is on that same plane as well. Isn't that interesting? There's a line with all three of those in a row and very little head above there. Right off the bat, that pattern tells me that this animal's evolved to spend time in the water. Imagine any creature that lives in the water, whether you're a predator that's hunting or you're a prey species that's needing to stay hidden, you want to show as little of your head as possible when you're moving through the water to keep you camoed underwater. It allows you to pop up, be able to hear, smell, and see without exposing much of your body and drop back in. Let's take a look at another animal that spends time in the water. So here's another animal, very different tooth structure than the last one we looked at it. You can see these teeth are not nearly as sharp, the molars back here. And there's a space right here, and then it's got these big, thick teeth on the front. So right now, when I look at this one, I think herbivore as opposed to the last one that's carnivore. I can tell that by the skull. But the other thing that's interesting with this one, and the pattern that it does have the same, is that same line across here. So I've got ear canal, I've got eye, and I've got nostril, all on that same line, which again tell me that this animal spends a lot of time in the water. So let's look at them side by side for a second. So one pattern is that flat skull, all of the senses lined along the top is a water species. But a different pattern would be the tooth structure, and these are going to group these with different family groupings. I'm going to show you one other one just to show you one that doesn't spend time in the water. Now this here is one of my favorite skulls I ever came across. It's actually a black bear. And there's an amazing story for that. Maybe I'll tell it on one of our live calls. We don't have time right now. But this skull here is actually different than the other two in that it's got these big, thick canine teeth up here for ripping flesh and meat, but it also has molars that aren't sharp like those back canine teeth on the other animal there. So that tells me that this animal is an omnivore. So now we've seen a herbivore, an omnivore, and a carnivore skull. But what I really wanted to point out in the pattern is notice how its eyes are right here, but its ears are actually down over here. It's got a big rounded top. Its nostrils up front here. So it's got a very different looking skull because it doesn't spend time in the water. So very different pattern there. So I hope looking at these skulls just gives you a little bit of a glimpse at how looking for patterns actually starts to tell us about the life strategy of that animal. It tells us about its diet. It might tell us a little bit about the habitat it hangs out in. Another interesting one is that patterns can also tell us whether something's a herbivore or a carnivore based on the eyesight sometimes. Most carnivores have what we call binocular vision, meaning both these eyes face straight forward, which allows them to perceive depth well. And if you're hunting, you need to be able to perceive depth to be able to strike. Versus herbivores, not all, but a lot of them actually have their eyes on the sides of their head, which give them a way wider range of peripheral vision, which means it's easier to spot a predator coming towards them, but it's harder for them to see depth. They don't see color as well. So it's really interesting to think about how that pattern tells us about their life strategy, just the placement of the eyes. So without even knowing these species, you could go to an entirely different country and start to learn things about that animal just by looking at the patterns in its skull. And we can do this with patterns in any aspect of nature, whether we're looking at a footprint or a track. We can look at patterns in trees, we can look at patterns in plants, we can look at patterns in weather. All of these patterns teach us about the language of nature. So the next grouping that we're going to look at right now that's really useful for our kind of goals for this call is looking at the patterns in families of wildlife. This will really help to get you to know the wildlife that live in your own backyard. I'm often amazed. People quite commonly know about animals over in Africa, and they can tell you all these facts about, zebras and rhinos, but people don't know what a muskrat is, or they don't know what a least weasel is. Or maybe they just say, oh yeah, we've got rabbits here, or bunnies, but they don't know that there's a huge difference between a cottontail and a hare. So in this piece, we're gonna actually dive into getting to know those families really well. And maybe you do know some of those animals already, but I'm gonna challenge you and say, how well do you really know them? It's one thing to watch a deer out in a field, or maybe watch a rabbit in a park. It's a whole nother thing to actually understand how that animal lives 365 days a year out in this landscape. That's where we're going with this, and just like in the beginning of this episode, it starts with understanding patterns, and that's what's gonna help our learning curve be exponential. So a great way to start is to do something we call a Mammals Master Species List. In order to learn what animals are here, and to learn from those animals, we need to know who's here to begin with. And we're gonna do this by grabbing ourselves a field guide. And what you're gonna do is you're gonna open up your field guide to the mammal section, and most of them have a range map that show you what area that mammal is found in, and they're organized by family groupings already. And in your workbook to go with this chapter, you'll see a spot to make your mammal species list. As you go through, you're literally just gonna look at the range map and say, is that in my area or not? And if it is, you're gonna put that animal down underneath the appropriate heading. So let's chat about what those headings are. If you're not following along already, make sure you open up your workbook to go with this chapter right now, or with week number 2. So Mammals Master Species List. In my area, so I live in Canada, in Ontario, on the edge of Algonquin Park. So I want to know what animals might be within, say, 100 to 200 kilometer range around where I am. You'll want to do this for your own area, but if you live anywhere in Canada, the United States, even a lot of Europe, these are going to be similar families in your area as they are where I am there. You might have to add 1 or 2, but for the most part, these will apply to you. So around here, we've got the ungulates, which are basically your hooved animals. So those are things like deer, like moose, like elk. We've got the weasels, which are otters and otters, minks, long-tail weasels, ferrets, those kinds of things, although ferrets aren't native or found in the wild here. We've got rabbits, which is our cottontail and our hare. We've got rodents, which is like beavers, squirrels, mice, voles. We've got canines, so our wild dogs. We've got felines, which are our wild cats. We've got insectivores, which are actually all their own individual families, but I kind of group them together because one pattern is the insectivore piece. So we've got moles, shrews, we've got bats, we've got skunks. And then my last grouping down there, I put others. So bears, opossums, porcupines. So here, every mammal that you're going to find is going to fit into one of those categories, and all of them have associated patterns, both in the designs of their body, in their diet, in the way they move, in their tracks. And understanding those patterns really helps us to actually know how to find those animals, how to observe them, and what we can learn from them. So the first mammal grouping we're going to talk about is the weasels, also called the Mustelidae family. So open up to the section in your workbook on the weasels and fill in some of this information as you go. So they're called the Mustelidae family because one pattern that connects all of these together and makes them all related is the fact that they have a musty gland in them. Sometimes you can smell weasels before you even see them, or you can smell their dens because of the musty scent that they leave in their dens. Something else that's really interesting, all these weasels, they all have long, slender bodies and really short legs. Not quite sure if this is actually a weasel here that I drew, but you get the idea there. Long body, short legs, they all have a long tail. And like in that skull I showed before of that water animal, they all have that carnivorous skull structure there where they've got the really sharp molars and then the sharp canine teeth. So that's a pattern that links all of the weasels together. So we know that they're all carnivores, they all have musty glands, and that's going to impact the way that they move through the landscape and the way that their body is designed. Now keep in mind, there's quite a difference on my master species list here. There's quite a difference from the least weasel, which is this tiny, tiny little weasel. It's almost the size of a mouse. If you don't know what a least weasel is, take that as a homework assignment to go do some research. There's some amazing videos on YouTube of least weasels hunting animals way, way bigger, like a little mouse-sized weasel taking down a giant hare or a giant cottontail rabbit. So check out the least weasels, a research project. But there's a big difference between the least weasel and, say, something like an otter, right? The otter lives in the water, the least weasel doesn't. An otter is very big, a least weasel is very small, but they all have these things in common. The musty gland, they're carnivores, they've got the long, slender body, the short legs. See how this is kind of working here? And because of the design of their body and the design of their skull and their tooth structure, they're going to hunt in a similar way, they're going to move in a similar way. And that's really useful for us as trackers and people trying to read the language of nature. So let's just do a quick little intro to the track here, and you can fill this into your tracking chart. So when I look at the track of weasels, and again, it's going to vary a lot from the smallest to the largest, but in general, I almost think of them as like an upside down ice cream cone. So the front part of the track is like a sideways oval, and then if the heel pad registers, which they don't always, it's often like the little cone coming down on the track, and then they've got 5 toes spread out across them, and they show claws. So in your chart there, you're going to want to write down that they have 5 toes on their front foot, 5 on their back, and that they show claws, and that for the track pattern, you've got this upside down ice cream shape, or ice cream cone there. Why that's really useful is, let's say I come across a track out in the field, and I'm trying to think, okay, this track could be absolutely anything right now. And the size range is very similar between, let's say, an otter track and a wolf track. There is actually an overlap between a small wolf and an otter. So how do you know which one it is? One of the tools that we can use here is that a wolf only has 4 toes on its front foot and 4 toes on its back, whereas an otter has 5. So by understanding how many toes are on each foot, it actually helps us put it into one of these families. So there's how patterns actually help us start to read that story. Now, this piece here, don't worry about it too much, but lope is the gait that it moves in. That's the way that the animal's body moves, and it speaks to the pattern that it leaves on the ground. And there's multiple different types of lopes. We don't need to get caught up on it, but the idea is it's going to leave a set of tracks, then there's a space and another set of tracks. Think of it like a slinky moving across the landscape or falling down a set of stairs. That's kind of how weasels move, and they register this lope pattern. Now here we've got a least weasel, a short tail weasel, which is also called an ermine, a long tail weasel, a mink, a pine marten, an otter, and a fisher, and that's actually going from smallest to largest in size. In your area, you may have some different weasels, so your master species list in your journal might be different than my master species list, so just consider that when doing your weasels journal.
Hey, it's Chris Gilmore here from Chris Outdoors, and I really hope you're enjoying this little intro to tracking video. This is just a little insert from actually a larger program and community cohort experience I run called Reading Nature's Language. And I wanted to just take this moment to invite you to learn more and consider joining us. It's a super fun program. If you want to be surrounded by inspiring community that push your kind of edges as far as your natural awareness and your knowledge of ecology, we have a whole bunch of pre-recorded materials. We've got the workbooks that I reference in this, but we also meet once a month, and we have these things we call virtual campfires, where we get together with other outdoor educators or just people with general outdoor interest, and we do all kinds of fun teaching. So I'll teach about, how to identify bird calls by their sounds, or bird language, what are the birds actually saying to each other. We dive into tracking, we dive into ecology, weather. I bring on amazing guest instructors. It's a ton of fun. So if this interests you, you can check out the link to join down in the comments below or in the description. You can also just go to chrisoutdoors.ca and you'll see the Nature's Language course there. And why don't we just hear for a moment what some of the other students say about their experience inside the cohort.
I think I encountered the problem of this being just a big green wall, like all these trees don't know what they are, all these leaves have no idea, all these prints in the ground, I don't know who made them. But once I started tracking,